So what was the Renaissance? It was a period of change. You'll have to determine how significant the change was. But in a nutshell, if you were wealthy and you could buy an education, the Renaissance was the time to be it. Okay? It was a great time. If, however, you were poor and uneducated, you'd have probably not noticed that the Renaissance was even going on. You can see there, it starts in Italy, and you can see from the areas that the Renaissance touched upon is that it's hardly anything to do with medicine. It is to do with everything to do with learning. Painting, architecture, astronomy instead of astrology, maths, geometry, physics, and arguing about religion. The Renaissance was an entire phenomenon that covered every aspect of life, of which medicine was a tiny part. All right? It was the rebirth. That's the translation from the Italian. The Renaissance was the rebirth of inquiry and questioning. This is what the Greeks and the Romans did. They sat down, they thought, they speculated, they questioned. Socrates and Plato, the great thinkers. And this was massively different because for the last 1,000 years, and Galen is the brilliant example of this, education was sit down, shut up, and listen. This is what Galen says. What did Galen say? Great, you're a doctor. That's how it worked. To question was wrong. And because often the church was in charge of education, to question was in fact a sin. So the people involved in the Renaissance were very, very brave individuals. Such questioning undermined long-held beliefs, Galen, and superstitions, and eventually led to the challenging of the all-powerful Catholic Church, which is the Reformation that you studied in year 8. The Renaissance was partly responsible for the Reformation which you studied in year 8. Protests against the beliefs of the Catholics led to the establishment of the Protestant Church. Right? You've studied all of that before. Does that fit into your story that you remember? Yeah, you're all gone mute. That's fine. So what did the Renaissance do to medicine? Well, there's two pictures to take a look at. I'm hoping that even though you didn't do the math earlier on, you can understand what you're looking at here. On the left, you've got a picture from the Bayeux Tapestry. Remember the Bayeux Tapestry? Year 7? One of you does. Wonderful. On the right, stretching your cultural understanding here. That is the statue of David by Michelangelo. Yes? Of course, sir. Of course, sir. Wonderful example of Renaissance architecture and sculpture. Look at the representations of the human body in both. What's happened between those two scenes? They're separated by what? 400 and something odd years. How has the representation of the human body changed? Well, which one? Which one is the more accurate of the two?
The statue of David.
Really? Yes. It is, isn't it? It is. Yet that's meant to be David, the guy who slew Goliath. So important figure from the Bible, yes. But it's not like this guy is some fictitious character from a Walt Disney cartoon. Who is that meant to be in the Bayeux Tapestry?
The king.
Yeah, which king? Which king had the Bayeux Tapestry commissioned? Oh, it's wounding, isn't it? Right. King William the Conqueror. Yeah? He wasn't. Yeah, it does say it on the board. Even more alarming that no one wants to read it. Okay, we're doing GCSE here. All right. If this is King William, yeah, nasty, powerful piece of work, King William, and he's not bothered about how his body is represented, yes, they obviously don't care too much. Because people didn't study the human body. That was God's creation, leave it be. But you couldn't have sculpted that without paying the most incredible attention to the human form. Right? Now the statue of David is really, really tall, and it's carved out of one solid piece of marble. And when it was unveiled by Michelangelo in Florence, In Italy, people thought he had bewitched a giant. They thought he had cast a spell over a giant and frozen them in that pose. So lifelike was the statue. But to have sculpted that, he must have paid attention to the human body.
Did it take him like 4 years?
I'm not sure how long it took him. But the bottom line is, in that, they look like cartoons. In this, it looks so lifelike, people thought it was magic. Something has changed in those 400 years. The Renaissance was so influential that it eventually affected everyone. The very fact that you question today goes to show that you are Renaissance people. But at the start of the Renaissance, it was for the wealthy and the wealthy only, because the wealthy could buy education. However, at the time, only the wealthy few benefited from the changes it brought. And this is a key point, because you may be asked, how significant was the Renaissance? And the people we will talk about today were incredibly significant, but most people never knew anything about them. So was the Renaissance a turning point or a trend? Well, if you were wealthy and educated, it was a turning point. If, however, you were poor and uneducated, it was part of a trend that went on for hundreds of years. Hundreds of years. But what those people who started the Renaissance did was build the foundations on which everything else has been built since. And that is a society that is built upon the concept of questioning. Nothing is sacred in terms of knowledge. Nothing is sacred. You are allowed to question religion. Religion is allowed to question science. Scientists question other sciences. Everything is questioned these days. 1,000 years ago, nothing was questioned. Give you another example of how medicine benefited. You've just seen the statue of David by Michelangelo. Leonardo da Vinci was a member, part of this Renaissance movement. You look at the attention he's paying to the human body. There's more detail on those sketches than in the entire Bayeux tapestry combined. Because Leonardo, when someone was stitching the Bayeux tapestry, someone said, don't bother too much about detailed attention. The human body is God's form. Leave it alone. Don't pay too much attention. Okay? Leonardo, to have drawn those drawings, he's not just looking at people when they're alive. He must be studying them when they're dead. He must be. To understand that attention, that detail of the muscle and the bone structure, the anatomy and the physiology, he must have been studying dead bodies. That was banned. But that's the only way he could have done it. And there are illustrations of him carrying out dissections on animals. There's very famous images of him carrying out autopsies on mothers who died in childbirth. Carrying out autopsies on them and writing and drawing about what he sees. But to show you the risks he was taking, everything he wrote was in code.
You written backwards.
It's not, yes, it's not only in code, it's written in backwards, which he did without the benefit of a mirror. Very few people that get Mutant Ninja Hero Turtles named after them. He was clever. He was a very brave man, but he was challenging and questioning the world around him. All right? Yet for all these discoveries and rediscoveries, you could argue that the Renaissance was a trend and not a turning point. You could still argue that. Because if you look at the following scenes, you see that the Renaissance didn't change the world overnight. That's a street scene from sometime in the Renaissance. Right? You studied this in Europe. This is the period of the Black Death. the Great Plague. Okay? Look at the way people are living. It's dirty, fetid, squalid. The Great Fire swept through London when it was built like this. There are no sewers. People throw their filth into the streets. People died in the streets. People lived amongst the rats that carried the fleas. And they didn't even care about it. It never occurred to them that the fleas were on the back of the rats. Rats were an everyday part of life. Yet the Renaissance is meant to have taken place. You wouldn't know it looking at it. Now, maybe in that scene there's a Leonardo, a Vesalius, or a Paré, but we are talking about individuals. Their discoveries were turning points. The impact of their discoveries was a trend. For most people, the Renaissance did not happen. There's not a lot of difference between that scene there and that scene there from the medieval period. Yeah, the towns are bigger, but they're unplanned, they're dirty, they're fetid, they're squalid, and the Black Death swept through it. So for all the discoveries, nothing is changing. And yet you compare that against Rome that we looked at earlier, and Rome, to a greater extent, is planned. Fresh water, sewers, paved roads, baths, drinking fountains, aqueducts. So for all the discoveries we associate with the Renaissance, for ordinary people, you'd have rather been in Rome 1,500 years before. It's not all about progress. Okay, so what was life really like in Renaissance England? I'm just going to show you how little things have changed. Only 1 in 10 people live past the age of 40. I'm 39. That's a frightening thought, isn't it? For me. You're thinking, well, statistically, there's a chance this lecture might end early. That's the kind of lives that people lived. Sewers in the streets. Toilets, if you had one, was like a bay window that hung out over the street with a little seat in the window and a dainty little hole in the window. And you did your business. And gentlemen, I'm sure I mentioned this before, the habit that we have in this country, what is good manners, that you walk on the outside of the pavement. Yes, you walk on the outside of the pavement with your good lady on the inside, is to make sure that the lady didn't get... Thank you. Lawrence swore. It's a good broadcast. I don't pick up the flack for that. Is that when this is thrown out the window, it would land on the gentleman, not on the lady. And why gentlemen traditionally wore hats was not to look stylish, like Mr. Darcy from Pride and Prejudice. It was to prevent that rude word that you said falling on your head. And of course the other reason was when a carriage came by on the road, there were no pavements, that all the crap that fell out the windows that was in the road that didn't hit you on the head would land in a puddle next to you, which would then be splashed on you instead. That's why gentlemen always wore longer coats. Coats with tails. There you go. A mine of information. Have a look, Brian. All right. We'll move on to that, and we'll look at the individuals then. Very briefly, we look at these individuals.